Hi all, thank you very much for attending our presentation on scaling privacy, practical architectures and experiences. A little bit about myself. My name is Aaron Colcard from Privacy. There, I am the Senior Director for the Center of Excellence. What that basically means is how do we show customers how to implement these practices and get the most value out of the product. And with me today presenting will be May, who will be actually showing us a really exciting demo of how all these, how we can actually do this in reality.
Thank you, Aaron. Hi, everyone. My name is May. I am a software engineer at Databricks, and I worked on integrating Privacy with Databricks DBFS views.
Yeah, it was a fantastic implementation, and we're going to see that in action today. So before we get started, over the last 4 to 5 years, it's probably become more prominent that we've seen privacy become more and more important and part of our workflows. And in fact, so important, just a couple months ago, Tim Cook at a privacy conference made this quote talking about how much it's becoming integrated and part of our process. Very, very, very critical to know how we do things. But first off, I'm gonna take a little stroll down memory lane. In my description of the session, I actually talked about how this was a little bit of a continuation from last year's session where I talked very much around privacy. But on that session, we didn't really talk or actually show it in action and actually bring it together. We just kind of showed about it. But I really think it's important for us to lay down some of these concepts because we're going to visit them in a different way. So when I think about what privacy is, almost every organization, every engineer, someone's usually responsible for making sure that we do the best around for our organization. And it's a policy, it's a legal obligation for us to do it. Almost every business, when we collect information around our customer or our products or how they're used, we now have an obligation to make sure that it's protected in the best way. But that usually begins to go counter to how do we actually build products and how do we actually democratize and get value out of data. So a little review here is we have 3 different main areas. We have security, we have compliance, and we have privacy. Security we're super familiar with. It's black and white. We know exactly when that line is, where we go, what we can and can't do. Very black and white. Privacy, it used to be a lot grayer because we had no best practices, we had no patterns, we didn't really have tools that were really implemented that could allow us to actually bring that into our daily process. That's changed in the last couple of years where we've been able to build those types of processes up. Now, compliance is our middle space, and we'll talk a little bit about compliance because that is really this process of making sure that you're following all these. More review is if we were to begin to design this type of ideal scalable system around privacy to begin to scale this up, these are the main 4 things that we'd begin to focus in on. One of them is user rights. How do we make sure that we understand how the data is used? How do we make sure that we follow rights around data reuse? How do we know it's flexible? On and on. Classification. How do we rapidly classify the data and actually know what it is? That's one of those key elements. Access. How do we have it support an agile process so that we can easily build it into our process? And the most important is that governance aspect. And how do we make sure that we audit it? So in the spirit of all things, I created a fictional company so that we could actually practically do this and actually just, rather than making it slides, we're gonna make this real, okay? So in order for me to set this up, I'm going to explain. We have a fictional company. I haven't come up with a name with it, so we'll just call it a company. And in this company, we have traditionally been afraid to go with machine learning and start really democratize data. I don't think that's very unfamiliar. That's very common right now, even still. The reason why is we deal primarily with research data around study participants, and that data usually we have to have someone come in, sign a consent right, and it's very hard to manage. So we have to be very delicate with it. But at the same time, by not being able to tap in with machine learning, we're also losing the opportunity to do better, notice patterns, notice opportunities for us to increase our capability. So we, like all great things, it seems that we usually start with some project name. I originally decided to call it Project X, then I filled in Project Mercury, because we have to get to space, and that's the project that got us to space. So a little bit about my company that I've made is we have 5 major groups where they have different types of data. We definitely have, compliance is so important in our company, they have their own group where they store data. But the most important one is this research group, where they're storing all the results of how this research data is coming together. So let's now build up our story. Let's put this into more practical terms. We want to build a machine learning model. We're going to, typically when we build a machine learning model, we take multiple data sets. So we're going to say there's 2 to 3 data sets here, just as an approximate. And they're going to be our training data. And when we do this, our data sets usually vary from some sort of external purchase data, which we still have to manage and know what those rights are, how we intended to use it. We have our internal data that's generated off of our own systems, how we put that together. We have a machine learning model. So our machine learning model, we're also going to put that into the same area and make sure that we manage it consistently. And then the logs, what actually people were sending in, we're also going to keep that, because when we put a machine learning model out live to the world, we don't know what results that are sometimes going to get sent to it. It depends on how we've implemented it, but sometimes you can get different results. And that information is we also have to take an account for as well. So I put up there security zones and resource policies. Those come from the Apache Ranger project, if you're familiar with that, where the security zone we're able to put and say, hey, here's a major area, that's the research, where we're going to then put diabetes as our data set and manage that with resource policy. So all that information that we're showing right here is going to go right into a resource policy and be administrated from one spot. Now, in the spirit of our organization has been following compliance, been trying to follow the spirit of the law, we're going to do a privacy impact assessment. Okay? A privacy impact assessment should be very familiar for anyone who's from Europe, where GDPR is more prevalent in your projects. They call that a data privacy impact assessment. And it looks very much like a privacy impact assessment, has a little bit different flavor. But essentially, these are the contents of what the privacy impact assessment look like. You define the scope of your project. That's pretty easy. We already set that up when we talked about that. We have to show where we got that data. Where did we internally generate it, externally get it from? Did we know the licensing? We have to identify, does it have PII? In this case, PHI, because it's going to be personal health information. We have to understand why we're collecting it. We understand how we're using this data and for what purposes and risk implications. Now, for anyone to have ever gone through one of these processes, it should be very familiar that this is a really high friction process, right? It's almost impossible. Sometimes you're almost on a daily call with the people who control the privacy and the legal, making sure that you're doing it correctly. And sometimes they're throwing questions out where you're like, how do I technically implement it? And people are just trying to figure out just what that process looks like. So let's make that a little bit easier. And to make that a little bit easier, May will take over and show us what governed agile data science looks like.
Thank you, Adam. So in this demo, we will be using machine learning to show how Privacera can help with access control. So for this particular machine learning problem that we are going to solve, we will be using scikit-learn diabetes dataset. The goal of the problem is to predict how diabetes progress in 1 year. And to capture that, we'll be using a progression metric. So the data that we have include patient information like BMI, blood pressure, and other measurements. And again, the output will be a progression metric for the disease. And to train the model, we'll be using ElasticNet linear regression. So the setup that I have here is a cluster with an MLR image, and Python will be the language that I use. So let's get started. So before we train our model, let's take a look at our data set. Our dataset lives under /dbfs/file store. And let's read our data. And we got an error. We failed to read the training data. Let's take a look at previous error audit logs. We could see that our read to this file path was denied. This was because we did not configure a resource policy, so let's add one. We'll name our policy as dbfs access, and we'll add the path where we have our training data to the resource path. Recursive here means all the children of this path share the same policy. I'll add myself as the user, and I'll give myself read permission to this data. Let's try again to read our training data. And this time it worked. Let's check our audit logs. And we could see that our read access to this file path was allowed. So our training data here, we have patient age, sex, BMI, and also at the very end, we have the progression metric for the disease. So after taking a look at our training data, let's create a helper method that will plot a descent path. And after this, let's start to train our model. As mentioned, we'll be using elastic-net linear regression for the training. And after we train our model, we'll be storing our model under another DBFS path. It's under /dbfs/mlflow/train test diabetes. After creating this helper method, let's start our training with our first set of parameters. And we can see that it fails to write the model to the DBFS MLflow path. Checking the audit logs, we could see the write access was denied. And this is because we did not add this path to our resource policy with a write permission. So let's do that. We will add the path where we plan to log our machine learning model. And then in addition to the write permission, we'll also give ourselves write permission in addition to the read one. And let's run our training method again. And this time it worked. Next, we can also see in the audit log that we had write access to the path, and we logged the model there. So after that, we can see our descent path. And we could also train our model with a few other parameters. Say we are happy with our first model and we would like to use it for inference. And we can load this model from the DBFS MLflow path. Checking the audit logs, we could see our read access to the MLflow model was logged here. And then we'll be using this model for inference. So in this case, we are reusing our training data set and take out the first row. And let's run this prediction. And here we get back a progression metric. That's it for the demo. In this demo, we show that private Sarah's access control can help with different types of data, whether that's your training data set or it's your machine learning model. And hand it back to you, Aaron.
No, thank you very much, May. That was a fantastic demo. Now, you'll notice that usually when you go to a session, the demo's at the end, and we put it right there towards the beginning, because I actually wanted to show you this actually working, becoming a living, breathing element, and integrating into it. And there's a lot of different details that you probably didn't notice inside there. Was data governance inside there? You probably didn't notice it, yet it was part of the process. We have the research data team, which we're going to put May on our research data team, even though she works for Databricks. She was able to build the machine learning model. She was able to build the data, and she was able to keep that all in one spot and manage that access control around it. Meanwhile, behind that, we had our governance, our data policy drivers, the people that are working in the governance parts of our organization who are also equally important. And they're important because they serve a function to help make sure our organization still always does the right thing, right? So you probably didn't notice it because we focused in like, how do you actually just do the action itself? How do you focus on the work, the value first, and then pull the tool out that enables it? So you didn't even notice that, except for when she was switching over to our tool, Privacera, that it was really affecting, the workflow. She was able to go through task after task after task. Now, did we pass the PIA? So did we balance democratize, right? So democratized data usually is the ability for us to access and manage and get in there and have almost like full ability to manage with that data with governance, which almost, usually when you're on a governance team, you almost begin to feel like you're the person saying no and setting up rules. But really, how do we balance that back to being an enabler? So I'll just talk about the things that we saw, okay? The things that we saw fine-grained access control, okay? We saw all the data models and the logs were controlled by one policy, and that was, so Delta, S3, ML Flow, they're all managed in one spot. She went to one resource policy and was making changes there. There's audit trails showing exactly what was working, what wasn't. So you're able to go one spot, single pane of glass, be able to get everything that was working and not working. I think one of the most important things that we're also able to see is when we do these types of projects against unstructured data, usually those processes do increase the amount of friction inside the organization because there usually isn't an ability for us to move governance back onto development. Usually we're negotiating and saying, well, let's keep it between this group and such. But we're actually able to apply that layer all the way back to development. And even more importantly, we're able to apply it to unstructured data. We didn't actually have to go finish it, then map it into something, and then say, okay, now let's go approve it. So we're able to keep that all moving. Things that you didn't see that were in the background, and I assure you they're there, is we're able to get the data movement of how it's being tracked and how it's going to be moved. We're able to understand exactly what the PHI, how it's used. And if we're to go back onto that PIA, we already knew what the scope was. We had to figure out where the lineage was, where the data was moving from. We had to know what the type of data was. We had to know what the contents of that data was. And that all allowed us to come up with the risk and implications. So this actually, to me, represents what's the true business value. We're trying to get things done for the organization. So I always think of data lakes, as kind of like a borderless data. We put data inside a spot, but and we try to collect and we try to bring the data together to build up all this value. And more importantly, what was the PIA, which is typically a long frictionless process between those stakeholders I showed in the last slide, is now actually a living, breathing, enabling element. We're making it walk together. Now, in the spirit, this presentation is called Practical Architectures and Experiences. So what I wanted to do was the next couple slides, we're going to talk about how do you actually go, what are some foundations so that we can actually take this and build a program off of it. We've been able to see it in action. How do we actually go do it? So when we start, when we start our architectures, we're always going to set out some principles. And these principles allow us to set up some lines or borders of how we think, how we approach the problem. And then we can always make our decision based off of our principles. So the very first one is build around services, not libraries. So many times when we, like for example, we implement some sort of encryption method, we'll build a library and then we stick it into the ETL process. Then when someone has changed the standard, then we have to go back and change that library. That becomes a very painful process. But if we build around services, the services can adapt, the services can inform, and they can help us change so that we separate that process. We focus in on like, how do we have policy approaches? And those policy approaches very much mimic like how we do policy in organization. So the example is, I want to change this encryption standard from 128 to 256 because it's now a change of the policy. Come up with a policy approach that allows us to change those and adapt those as we go. Separation of duties is very important. I'll dig into that a little bit into that. But my most important thing is, think about how your processes, your principles, how you're going forward, how are you actionable? How are you actually putting the business outcome, the business value front and forward, and keeping that balance? The last, it's usually the most, in my experience, I've usually seen the most pushback on, is plan to be scalable from the start. I'm sure everyone has always gotten that pushback where it's like, well, that's too much work, or why do you have to think about this? But when I say being scalable from the start, it's basically this concept that, look, if you're successful doing this, they're only gonna want more. So that 1 million hour problem that I put up above, that's actually gonna start appearing. All of a sudden, that 5-minute decision that could have been a 15-minute piece of work, all of a sudden, that 15 minutes down, it's now 15, 30, 60, and then eventually becomes a 1 million hour problem, and it's down the line, and you can't make those changes. So think about how you're scalable from the start, because you plan to be successful, right? So if you're successful, you'll be able to adapt and change. Thread the build versus buy equation. Okay, so by the way, this isn't a sales pitch, by the way. You'll see where I'm going with this. So I promise you. So authorization is hard, okay? So when you have a policy-based approach, you can actually begin to have those real practical conversations about what's changing. So an example here could be that the policy drivers may be still deciding, what does it mean to be sensitive? What does it mean to be secure? Okay, and this changes according to the scenario that you're in. So you may say, okay, well, the data is only intended for this group, and these other groups will never have it, and we trust this group, so they can always look at the personal information, right? But this other group, they're not certified to go look at this stuff, so make sure you go do this type. Well, if we're leaning towards a policy-based approach, we can adapt to those different groups, because we never know when that's going to change, when someone's going to make that one request and say, give me access to this, and then, you know, did you actually plan that out? Did you think about like what happens if they get access? You want to make sure that you have a process where it's just very easy. You go in and change the policy. Oh yeah, they changed, this is what it means now. Oh, okay, this, you know, the popular one is usually the marketing people can't look at PHI. I don't know as if I had a marketing group in my fictional company, but if they were to request, hey, let me look at the diabetes information so I can go advertise some fantastic result, we have to be able to control that. And our policy drivers are usually going to say no, but this is the advice. The next is, you'll notice at the beginning, I organized the different parts of the company. The companies were already very clear, right? We had 5 different sections that said exactly what they were, and then the resource policy then mimicked exactly how we're actually going to implement it. So when we're creating these organizations, we want to think in terms of the business, because the business only talks in terms of the business, right? And so the examples here, like if we have customer, or if I was to build, you know, my fictional company, if it was to be an airline, and I had my product is flights, and I have customers, and I have marketing group, those are going to be what my organization schemes are going to look like. Now you'll see, because we have this policy-based approach, you have a lot of flexibility of how you define what's underneath there and what constitutes this organization. So, but that, once you have that organization scheme worked out, you'll be able to understand exactly how to map. Now, we'll naturally, through that resource and security policies, you'll be able to actually be able to understand and find all these assets later once you look at the raw data. Now, my final thought on here is tagging strategy. So I used the example of the fictional airline that I'm running now. I like to build a lot of companies in my mind. So I now have organized my data into flights over here, into my airplanes over here, and into my customers. Inevitably, when I start describing flights, I may start describing who were the customers who flew on those flights. So how do I have a tagging strategy that allows us to find where did the customer information go? So tag the information so that we know it's tagged as a customer. We know that this describes flight, and they may follow each other into these different organization areas, but you'll always be able to find it and search for it and understand exactly where it is. My final, now at the beginning I talked about how privacy has become more black and white in the recent couple of years. So I've attended a couple great sessions here at Spark Summit, and I was able to see a lot of examples how this has become, privacy and these rules have become more and more prevalent, and people have come up with a lot of beautiful solutions on how to solve these problems. The key advice and what I hyperlinked up here, and you'll be able to have access to these slides later and be able to see these hyperlinks, these actually go off to government websites where they actually show, like, how do you put these things in? What's the black and white? What do you care about? The GSA, they have a lot of policies and procedures, what a PIA looks like, how you would actually run that through as the procedures, or even the training requirements. The HIPAA one's really important because HIPAA actually lays out like standards. How are you going to de-identify this data? And they have the long way where they can talk about how you implement something really complicated and how you have statistical analysis to make sure it's not re-identified, and you have an expert determiner in that process. You also have another process which is called the safe harbor, where we can have 18 classified attributes that if we implement those and make sure that they're secure, relatively you're safe and good to go. But you can read more about that on those websites and get more. The biggest thing is usually, the engineers usually get pulled into these processes to start making these decisions. And this is usually when we get the 1 million hour problem. So I called it Build and They Will Come. Recently I watched Field of Dreams, still a good movie, still a tearjerker. Usually what happens is because we get stuck into this process, we begin to build a do-it-yourself process, right? We begin to build a patchwork of different processes. We begin to build these libraries, and we start maintaining it. And the more and more we start trying to tackle these one-on-one conversations in these meetings, we have to support that over time. So we need a way to kind of pull it back. And so this is what I meant by the buy versus build. Buy can sometimes mean just an open source project. How do we find an open source project that we bring in who's already tackled most of these challenges versus going off and having to build the project ourselves? In this case, you saw our product, which is actually based on an open source project, Apache Ranger, which has the security policies, the resource zones, all that built in. So it actually simplifies and allows you to not have to worry about reinventing the wheel, but just use that project. The last one is having a policy approach allows you to tackle the intent to use. And by using attribute-based access control and masking policies, you can change how that data is seen. So you can have relative flexibility. You could come up with a rule that says every time the marketing folks come and look at this, if we know that it's health information, obfuscate it, make sure that it's not seen, nullify it, make sure that it cannot be ever even read to be backed up. My final is, and this is my final practical experience, is mostly I just love the picture of the mouse, he's cute. And this is also my favorite phrase, where make sure that the mouse isn't guarding the cheese. So when we talked about the HIPAA process, we talked about expert determination. And these processes are going to be usually repeated for privacy. How do we scale this? So if we have the person who's usually the best suited to figure out, can this be statistically re-identified, is usually someone in the data science department. That's where we put all of our statistical people. But they're also going to be the people who are going to be making these requests to make sure that this process ends up being able to deliver value. So you have to make sure that the same person who's making the request isn't also approving the request, otherwise it defeats the spirit. But it doesn't actually have to be a person. It can be a process. So you could build a process to automate that process and keep that out from actually occurring. Now with that, I thank you very much for attending this session with me and May. We're going to open up the questions and questions. And we actually have things to give away for people to ask questions. Do we have a microphone? Yeah. Yep.
My question is related to the ML model where we have implemented the governance. So the governance that I saw that you have implemented is just the access, or are we doing any kind of encryption over there?
In this case, it was just about access. I wanted to keep the demo. We wanted to keep the demo simple and easy to explain, so we just focus on access. But we can do more with it.
Okay, because most cases when data scientists use the data in-house, they may want to see the data, even the PIE, PHI data. So how you handle that?
Yes, so earlier in the demo, May actually showed her looking at the data itself.
Yeah.
And so you can actually implement different types of policies, masking policies, access control policies, column level or fine-grained access, which can control the visibility of how it's seen, even if it's returned at all. Okay. So you can return it, you can say, I don't want to return it because this person doesn't have the access to it. You could say, like what happened in the demo, you can't go inside of it, we'll just return an error. You could obfuscate it, you could return some sort of hash that represents it. You could even return some sort of synthetic type of representation of what that data looked like so that you're still staying statistically relevant to how you build models.
Okay, last question, because recently we had that incident. So say if somebody wants to look at the date of birth column, and we don't want to provide exactly the date of birth, but we still don't want to compromise the year. So do we have any customized way of governing in that particular layer?
Repeat it again.
So date of birth is like very critical for any analysis, but we didn't want to introduce exactly the date of birth, like the date and the month. But at the same time, we didn't want to lose the information. So not showing the date and the month, how we can govern that particular attribute?
That's good. Are we talking more like how we're going to govern an attribute, or the scenario of like how, like the government?
That particular, because that's very critical. So we just want to expose the year, but implementing something that should not show exactly date and the month.
Yeah, so if we were to expand out onto it, we could show you like how you can, one, apply a tag to that column to say, hey, what type of column is it? And then you can actually apply those types of rules to the tag or specifically to the column.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
But generally, you're going to want to go just to like say, hey, by the way, example, that's a social security number, or that's like a sensitive year. And then that way you can come back and ask like, where is all the social security numbers? Yeah. And then even answer the question like, so what happens with the social security number when someone sees it? I've seen it more often than not. The question is, so who saw it and when did they see it?
Yeah. Thank you.
A quick question. You talked about masking and obfuscation. So can you do a column level encryption and decryption based on policies?
Absolutely. In fact, later today we're doing another session at 4 o'clock, and we're actually going to cover that in the demo.
And tokenization is also possible?
Yes.
And is there anything you're doing for the China PIPL that's coming up where the data cannot get transferred?
Yeah, but I
US?
can't. I mean, most of that's like in design, but the China regulations do make it very interesting, right?
Yep.
Which is like, for example, usually the way that you manage access across even like how the cloud has to have a different way of managing it, as well as then also how do you even manage the data itself within that environment.
More to come. Okay,
So
thank you.
definitely tackling it. It's very important to a lot of customers.
When you're mastering centralized policies with something like a masking policy, do you ever see a problem with impacting reproducibility of an experiment or model based on the fact that it's been changed and the downstream consumer may not be aware of that? So in the previous example, if you had a full date of birth with day, month, and year, and it was changed to just the year, is that ever a problem you've seen? Is there any solution to that problem?
That's a good question. So you've done a data science model, you've made changes to it. Are we tracking like what was the impact? Not currently, but that's a great idea and how we can actually improve it and how we can actually track it. Now I'd say indirectly, you have the audit logs that show the time, right? But you don't actually have the context of what actually changed. Did we detect that? But I think that's a great idea. Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you very much for the questions. I'm sure we still have things to give away for even talking off. Thank you very much.